Laura Carter and Daniel Hayes thought they had planned the perfect crime, a cold, calculated betrayal that would rid them of Richard Carter, the man standing between them and a life of wealth and freedom. But as the investigation unraveled their carefully staged lies, one mistake after another sealed their fate, turning their twisted scheme into a chilling tale of greed, deception, and inevitable justice. Richard Carter was a man admired by many in the community. In his late 40s, he had spent years building his construction business from the ground up, turning it into a respectable and profitable company. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a devoted husband, a generous friend, and most importantly, a loving uncle. His younger brother James had always struggled financially, and when he passed away suddenly, Richard took it upon himself to help raise James's son, Daniel. Daniel grew up with every advantage Richard could provide. He was sent to good schools, given job opportunities, and treated as if he were Richard's own son. But despite the help, Daniel never seemed to appreciate the sacrifices made for him. He had little ambition, drifting from one failed business idea to another. He dabbled in investments that never paid off, borrowed money from dangerous people, and developed a taste for gambling. With no stable income, he relied on Richard's generosity to bail him out time and time again. Richard, patient as ever, hoped Daniel would eventually find his way. Richard's wife Laura had a different perspective. In her early 40s, Laura was elegant, intelligent, and accustomed to the finer things in life. She had once loved Richard deeply, but as the years passed, the passion in their marriage faded. She found herself restless, craving excitement, and frustrated with her husband's devotion to work. Richard was a good man, but his predictability and long hours left her feeling lonely. Daniel, with his reckless charm and dangerous lifestyle, intrigued Laura in ways Richard never had. What started as casual flirtation during family gatherings soon spiraled into something far more sinister. Daniel fed into Laura's dissatisfaction, whispering that she deserved more, that she had wasted her youth on a dull marriage. Laura, drawn to his confidence and thrill-seeking nature, allowed herself to fall deeper into temptation. The affair between Laura and Daniel was reckless, fueled by secrecy and greed. They met in hotel rooms, exchanged hidden messages, and schemed about a future where they wouldn't have to hide. But there was one problem: Richard. He was the obstacle standing in the way of their happiness, the man who controlled the wealth that could free them both from their current lives. Laura wanted out of her marriage, but a divorce wouldn't be enough. Richard's life insurance policy, combined with his business assets, promised a future of luxury if only he were out of the picture. At first it was just an idea, a fantasy they entertained in whispered conversations. But as Daniel's debts grew and the pressure mounted, their thoughts darkened. They convinced themselves that Richard's death would be a tragic accident, one that would solve all their problems. Daniel would escape his financial ruin, and Laura would finally be free. What started as a passionate affair had turned into something far more dangerous. They were no longer just lovers sneaking around behind Richard's back. They were conspirators, bound by a deadly secret, planning a crime that would soon destroy them both. Daniel's financial troubles had reached a breaking point. The people he owed money to weren't just impatient, they were dangerous. He had borrowed from loan sharks, convinced he could turn a quick profit, but every gamble had failed. The threats had started small, just aggressive phone calls and warnings, but now they were escalating. A few days earlier, he had found his car tire slashed, a silent message that time was running out. If he didn't pay soon, there would be consequences far worse than ruined rubber. Desperation led him straight to Laura. She was the only person who understood his frustration, his anger, his need to escape. He laid out his situation, hoping for sympathy, but Laura didn't flinch. Instead, she saw an opportunity. Richard had always been the one standing in her way, controlling the money, making all the decisions, treating her like nothing more than an afterthought. If something were to happen to him, everything would change. She wouldn't just be free of a loveless marriage. She would be wealthy beyond measure. Daniel hesitated at first. This was his uncle, the man who had provided for him, bailed him out more times than he could count. But when Laura spoke, she made it sound so simple. Richard's life insurance policy alone was worth a fortune, not to mention the business assets and the house. Laura would inherit it all. And with her as Daniel's partner, the money would be his too. There was no need to feel guilty. Accidents happened all the time. The plan needed to be flawless. Laura knew Richard wouldn't suspect anything if she played her part right. She suggested a weekend trip to their lake house, a secluded property where Richard often went to unwind. The idea was easy to sell. She would tell him he had been too stressed, working too hard, and that he needed a break. She would insist on staying behind, claiming she had errands to run. Once he was there alone, Daniel would handle the rest. When he was there alone, Daniel would handle the rest. They considered several ways to make the death look like an accident. A boating mishap seemed ideal, but it carried too many risks. Richard wasn't a reckless man. Authorities might question how he drowned. Instead, Daniel suggested a staged robbery. He could break into the house, take some valuables, and make it seem like Richard had caught the intruder at the wrong time. A struggle, a fatal injury, and then the killer, whoever the police imagined him to be, would flee into the night. Laura was thrilled by how easily the pieces fit together. She played her part perfectly, convincing Richard to go to the lake house without a second thought. As he packed his bags, she kissed him goodbye, whispering that she'd see him in a few days. What she didn't say was that this was the last time he would ever leave their home. Alive. Daniel arrived at the lake house first, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. The night was cold, and the lake house sat in eerie silence. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees and the soft lapping of water against the wooden dock. Inside, Daniel remained hidden, his heart pounding as he waited for Richard to arrive. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no room for hesitation. Every second that passed brought him closer to the moment he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Richard pulled into the gravel driveway just after sunset, stepping out of his car with a tired sigh. He had been looking forward to a weekend of peace, unaware that danger lurked inside the very house meant to be his retreat. As he carried his bag inside, Daniel watched from the shadows, his grip tightening around the metal pipe he had brought to use as a weapon. The plan was to strike quickly and efficiently, leaving no room for struggle. Richard couldn't see his face. There could be no evidence linking him to the crime. Richard moved through the house, turning on lights, setting his things down, and pouring himself a drink. He had no reason to suspect that anything was out of the ordinary. The lake house was his sanctuary, a place where he had spent countless weekends relaxing. He didn't notice the slight movement in the corner of the room, the shadow that shouldn't have been there. The first blow came without warning. The pipe connected with the back of Richard's head with a sickening thud, sending him collapsing to the wooden floor. He let out a sharp gasp, his body twitching from the shock. Daniel stood over him, breathing heavily, the weapon still clutched in his trembling hands. It had been easier than he thought. No struggle, no resistance, just one clean hit. But the job wasn't finished yet. Acting quickly, Daniel dragged Richard's unconscious body toward the back door, leaving a faint trail of blood on the floor. The cold night air stung his skin as he hauled his uncle onto the dock, where the dark waters stretched out endlessly before him. The stones were already prepared, tied together with thick rope, waiting for their purpose. With shaking hands, Daniel secured them to Richard's ankles, making sure there was no chance of survival. As he pushed Richard's body into the water, the weight pulled him under instantly. The lake swallowed him whole, ripples spreading outward before disappearing into stillness. It was done. Daniel stood on the dock, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at the empty surface of the water. There was no turning back now. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, forcing himself to focus. He had to make the scene look right. Back inside, he staged the break-in, knocking over furniture, scattering drawers, and taking a few valuables to sell the story. Then he left, driving away under the cover of darkness, leaving behind nothing but a carefully constructed lie. In the days following Richard's disappearance, the story played out just as Laura and Daniel had planned. Laura reported him missing early Saturday morning, her voice laced with carefully rehearsed panic. She told the police that Richard had gone to the lake house for a quiet weekend, but had stopped answering his phone. When officers arrived at the property, they found his car parked outside, his bag still inside, and signs of a break-in. Overturned furniture, drawers pulled open, and a few missing valuables. To anyone looking at the scene, it seemed like a robbery gone wrong. The lake was searched, but the initial sweep turned up nothing. Laura clung to the idea that maybe Richard had been kidnapped or had fled in fear. She played the role of the devastated wife with perfection, sobbing into cameras when local news stations picked up the story. The community rallied around her, offering support, but the police remained cautious. Something about the entire situation didn't sit right. By the third day, Richard's body was found. A fisherman spotted something unusual floating near the far side of the lake, partially tangled in weeds. When officers arrived, they discovered the gruesome truth. Richard's body, weighed down by heavy stones, had been pulled up by the current. The crime scene was no longer just a missing person case. It was now a murder investigation. The autopsy revealed disturbing inconsistencies. The bruising on the back of Richard's head suggested he had been struck before entering the water. If it had been a simple accident or an interrupted burglary, why would someone have taken the time to weigh him down? The staged robbery, once convincing, now felt deliberate. The police began to ask questions that neither Laura nor Daniel were prepared to answer. Investigators started looking into Richard's life and financial records. They discovered his sizable life insurance policy and how Laura stood to inherit everything. That alone wasn't enough to convict her, but when they checked phone records, they found something even more damning. Constant communication between Laura and Daniel in the days leading up to the murder. Even on the night of Richard's death, there were multiple calls between them. Then came the biggest mistake of all. A witness, an older man who lived near the lake, reported seeing an unfamiliar car parked outside the lake house the night Richard arrived. The description matched Daniel's vehicle. When confronted, Daniel claimed he had been at home that night, but his alibi quickly crumbled under scrutiny. As the pressure mounted, Laura and Daniel's carefully planned crime began to unravel. Laura became defensive, lashing out at detectives when questioned too aggressively. Daniel, usually cocky and confident, started to crack under the weight of suspicion. They thought they had committed the perfect crime, but the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks. The police weren't just investigating a robbery gone wrong anymore. They were looking at something far more sinister, a planned, cold-blooded murder driven by greed and betrayal. And they were closing in fast. As detectives pieced together the evidence, the net around Laura and Daniel tightened. What had once seemed like a perfect crime was now riddled with inconsistencies, and neither of them was prepared for the relentless pressure of a full-scale murder investigation. The murder and investigation. The final blow came when forensic analysts examined the knots on the ropes used to weigh Richard's body down. The technique used was specific, not something an ordinary burglar would know. Investigators found that Daniel had a history of working on boats and was familiar with the exact type of knots used. It was a small detail, but in a murder case, small details made all the difference. Confronted with mounting evidence, Daniel panicked. His usual arrogance had crumbled under the weight of his guilt and fear. He tried to cover his tracks, deleting messages and distancing himself from Laura, but it was too late. Police arrested him first, charging him with murder. When Laura learned of Daniel's arrest, she knew her time was running out. She tried to control the narrative, claiming she had nothing to do with Richard's death, that Daniel had acted alone out of desperation. But detectives weren't fooled. They had uncovered her internet search history, searches about life insurance payouts, drowning accidents, and ways to make a death look like an accident. Combined with the phone records, financial motive, and her affair with Daniel, the case against her was undeniable. She was arrested shortly after, charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The trial became a media sensation. The story of a grieving wife and a trusted nephew turned cold-blooded killers fascinated the public. Prosecutors painted the picture of a woman consumed by greed and a man willing to kill his own uncle for money. Laura's attempts to play the victim fell flat in court, especially when Daniel, in a desperate attempt to save himself, turned against her. Daniel claimed Laura had manipulated him, that she had planted the idea of murder in his head, promising him a life of wealth and freedom. His defense team tried to argue that he had been pressured into committing the crime, that Laura was the true mastermind. But the jury saw through his lies. Both of them had willingly planned and executed the murder, and both would pay the price. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Laura, though not the one who physically killed Richard, was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 25 years. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read, except for the quiet sobs of Richard's remaining family members, those who had truly loved him, unlike the people who had taken his life. What had started as a desperate scheme for wealth and freedom had ended in complete destruction. Daniel and Laura lost everything, their freedom, their futures, and each other. Richard, the man who had given them both so much, had been betrayed in the worst possible way. But in the end, justice had prevailed.